It's my pleasure to introduce the next panel, which is Can Science Lead the Way in Biodiversity and Climate Policy? And our moderator is Maggie Fox. She's not in your program, so I'm going to give you a little bit of her background. She spent over 20 years as the deputy director of the Sierra Club. She spent about 3 or 4 years as president of America Votes. She was president and CEO of Climate Reality Project for 6 years, working with Al Gore. And basically, she now is a consulting specialist with Maggie Fox Strategies. She loves strategic thinking, totally inspires her, along with being an outsider. And to prove that, she spent a month walking through Bhutan recently.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Maggie. How are all of you? And I don't want to be an outsider. I love being outside. There is a difference, perhaps minimal, but nonetheless significant enough to mention. The question posed by this panel, can science lead the way towards climate and biodiversity policy, is an obvious yes. So we decided to reframe the question, because what would we talk about? And really actually go to the role of science communications in leading the way towards new climate and biodiversity policy. Both of these amazing women who I've met just in the last week through phone conversations and meetings yesterday are ideally suited to talking about this with us this morning. I think it's, and we like to think that this conversation, short as it might be, is just a proxy for communicating about any version of a biodiversity or climate issue, not just science. That the lessons learned, the challenges we've faced in communicating science knowledge with the attacks that science has been under in the last number of years ferociously, as well as the weaponizing of science, is really replicated throughout every aspect of the work we do on biodiversity and climate, or water, or any other subset issue. The other point of view we bring to this conversation is that the notion, and this is a touch of heresy, I suspect, that biodiversity is a subset of a climate impact issue is, I think, something we really need to revisit. And I will take some major responsibility for coming to that realization way too late in a wonderfully long career. And so I come to you as a bit of a mea culpa in that context. I think those of us, I began my career as a lawyer, left that behind pretty quickly, and an advocate and working in the world of policy, of course then politics, and then endless amounts of time and process. And I learned one very important thing along the way, that all the work we were doing, no matter what aspect of the environmental movement you're part of, we have a great song to sing to those in the same choir with us. But we've had a very hard time reaching beyond that. And the work of reaching people, whether it's policymakers, which both of these women have extraordinary experience in at all levels, but also people, the broader public, has been our challenge. And the lessons learned in the difficulties around science communication in those two venues are replicated in everything we do. So we really want to speak about communication as one of the most significant challenges facing us. And the other aspect of the conversation is really focused on the natural solutions that we can employ to get us out of the mess we're in, rather than seeing nature-based solutions as an afterthought, a stepchild, a foster child, maybe even an unborn child that we haven't decided to bring into the world yet. That in fact we need to actually move this conversation to seeing nature-based solutions at the front of the line instead of at the back of the line. So in a few short minutes, we're going to try to dance that dance and see how it goes. On my left is Tina Kurvitz, who is working for AREI-AREDAY, and she'll have to help us understand that because none of us do, and that's why we have her here. She's a talented biologist, and you've got her bio. I don't want to spend time looking at the specifics of her bio, but just say she's utterly qualified to be here today, and she's really going to lead the conversation on the excitement around blue carbon with a slide and some information about that, and really get us looking at nature-based solutions. The most important thing I think about her is that her love of wildlife biology and animal behavior is what brought her to this work, and therefore the only thing that's missing is that she doesn't have her binos on today, even though there are a lot of animals in the room. On my right is Michelle Wyman, who also has had a very distinguished career, really focused over in a variety of different roles at ICLEI and where she is today, City of Fort Collins, when she worked there a number of years ago, with creating conversation with decision makers, whether elected or appointed, at all levels of government, from very local all the way to international. She's worked with the World Bank and the UN, and you can tell from her manner, she's very good at it. She has a quiet patience and a rebellious side, which I adore, which comes up maybe in a small anecdote about bringing Newt Gingrich into a policy conference of scientists at which there was a bit of a rebellion to bring the enemy into the room. She's also the mother of 4 with 3 dogs, 2 horses, 1 horse, and a hedgehog. So she's completely qualified to deal with policymakers and decision makers all over the world. And I would say better than most of us by tenfold. So let's open the conversation with Tina talking about blue carbon, which is another piece of exciting natural solution that warms our hearts in the midst of a complicated future.
Oh, did I already mess it up? I thought I...
We could see it here for a few minutes. We need the Compton Singers. No, there we go.
Ah, there we go. Okay. Sorry about that. So I've had the opportunity to talk with a number of you over the last couple of days about what AREI-AREDAY does, and you've probably still have a lot of questions because we do a lot of things. But one of the things that we do work on and that I work on personally are related to nature-based solutions. And one of the recent ones is oceanic blue carbon, or in this sort of drilling down into whale carbon. You've heard that over the last couple of days it's been mentioned that the ocean is responsible for every second breath we take. So the phytoplankton take in the carbon dioxide, they sequester about 40% of the carbon dioxide. They release about 50% of the oxygen that we need to survive. So we have some understanding of the role of the phytoplankton, of zooplankton, but a new question that's been looking at it by the scientists are, what about other ocean life? The other marine, or not other, these are not phytoplankton, are not vertebrates, but what about marine vertebrates? So there's been some studies looking at what can other marine life contribute to carbon sequestration. Now, when we look at whales, whales are phenomenal animals, and I hope a lot of you saw the film about Paul Watson the other night, because there's a lot of amazing things about these animals that some of the species we've really driven to the brink. But there are 5 different pathways that whales can sequester carbon, and they do it directly and indirectly. Directly, they sequester carbon in their bodies, like all of us. We're all here, we're all carbon-based life forms. But when whales die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean, and there, the carbon that they've been sequestering all their lives gets trapped in the ocean sediments, and it can be locked in there for not just decades, but centuries. And we're talking 33 tons on average per individual animal. The other way that they sequester carbon is the indirect path. So whales, they will dive down to feed, and then they come up to breathe and to poop. And that poop is very rich in nutrients that the phytoplankton then need to grow. Whales also migrate incredible distances. So they will go from very nutrient-rich feeding grounds in the middle latitudes, and then they migrate up to the nutrient-poor breeding grounds at the higher latitudes. Same thing. They do their thing up there, they poop, and the phytoplankton go crazy. And then so that's called the great whale conveyor belt. And then the other way that they contribute is just by the simple mechanism of swimming up and down to feed, up to breathe. And so they're stirring things up. So they get some nutrients cycling there as well, and that's also good for the phytoplankton. So this is, it's not brand new, but it is new in terms of looking at it for what is the actual carbon sequestration potential of this. But then as we've been discussing over the last couple of days, you can look at this as a climate change thing, or you can look at it as a biodiversity issue. Because what we want to look at as well is like, okay, so if we brought back whales to healthy populations, pre-whaling populations, it's not just the whales, it's the whole ecosystem. Because you can't bring back a species in isolation. And so we're talking about healthy marine ecosystems, but then of course that means healthy terrestrial ecosystems. So sometimes if we just help nature heal, we help ourselves heal.
Thank you.
Sorry if it took a little too long.
No, you didn't take too long at all. It's fascinating. Part of the reason we talked about this in the last few days as an example is just these natural systems that we have barely begun to understand. And all species across the planet are obviously a big part of the solution if we would just put our attention to it. In some ways, it reminds me of the magnificence of moving forward, partnering science with indigenous knowledge to make decisions that are obviously reparation for both the planet and for human beings on all levels. So, Michelle, so what's it been like being in the world of divided politics and trying to bring science, which has become greatly attacked and weaponized, into the world of climate and biodiversity policy, and what are some of the lessons you've learned, and what are some of the mistakes you've seen us make, and what are some ideas that you've seen making a difference in one way or another? And I didn't tell her I was going to ask her that.
No, thank you, Marty. I think, I want to first answer by using the example that we just saw.
Yes.
Of blue carbon and the simplicity of that slide. How much science is embedded behind it. And that's what matters to the scientist.
Right.
What matters to the decision maker sitting on the other side of the table is that they can understand what that slide says. To take it a step further to your question, how do we then make certain, as we look for opportunities to bridge knowledge production with knowledge use, that the examples from the scientific community that we're capturing reflect the interests, the language, the context, and the culture of the decision makers that we're putting them in front of. One of my goals when I work with decision makers is to understand why they ran for office, why they do what they do. It's not easy, we know this. And if those of you in the room haven't run for office or served in office before, I certainly haven't, you've spent time with somebody who has. And if you haven't done that, you've read the top line news. There's a level of vulnerability there that people expose themselves to when they choose to do this, which is very different from somebody who's a scientist. It's far less common that we have the benefit of somebody like Tina and so many others we've heard from in the last couple of days, where they're comfortable, outward-facingly sharing what they do. So when you think about the decision maker and you're thinking about how to understand how to relate to them and make sure that the information and knowledge contributes to evidence-based decision making and policy deliberation, understanding what they care about goes so far right out the gate. Coming with an example that you know will immediately resonate with what their priorities are. So when I work with mayors in Texas, I don't go in, planning to talk to them about how much they need to believe in climate change. I go in understanding that their communities are facing dire numbers around criteria air pollutants. And I talk to them in terms of not only public health impacts, but economic impacts. The awesome part is we have an extraordinary level of intellectual capital that we all have access to, and that is the scientific community. And I would say that in the most unintended consequence, science today is having a heyday. It is and has been weaponized. That's not new. But we also are seeing science being more widely recognized for the absolutely imperative role that it plays in society in all ways than we have in many years. The scientific community, we couldn't have planned a better campaign for ourselves. So what we think about regularly, even when there's something ridiculous, like some of the tweets that we saw from our previous panel, putting forth by the current person in the White House, how do we then turn that around and use that as a strength to grab onto all of the most current science to contribute to resilient, sustainable decision-making?
Great. Tina, talk to us a little bit about some other things that you're studying that are part of this natural-based solutions, a little bit beyond whales, or some of the things that Grid Arendal are doing and you're doing specifically that will help us see the role of natural systems in the solution suite.
So one of the big projects that I'm working on right now, it's a global environment facility project called Blue Forests. And that's looking at coastal blue carbon. So that's mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes. We have sites around the world working with, I think, about 7 different countries. And it's really testing the concept. So part of it is looking at what is the actual value of the carbon being held in those ecosystems. And there's a range of numbers around there saying that they're actually more effective at sequestering carbon than our terrestrial forests. Some of that may have been over-optimistic, but that's part of what we're doing. We're looking at the science. But the other part is of the project is restoring those coastal carbon ecosystems. So when you restore something like a mangrove forest, it's not just for the carbon value, it's for the whole range, the whole suite of biodiversity, of ecosystem values. So the communities behind those mangroves, they get access to fish nurseries, so it helps their livelihoods through fishing, through tourism. A number of our sites are developing mangrove honey operations. There's protection from storm surges, and we know that the weather is getting more violent, more extreme, less predictable. So all of those things, again, it's that low-hanging fruit. This is about as low-tech as you can go, but restoring those ecosystems actually helps the people. Helps.
So maybe we shouldn't assume that everybody knows what mangrove honey is.
Oh, it's just instead of honey from clover, the bees are feeding on the flowers in the mangroves.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm from Canada. You have it here in the U.S. in Florida. I just brought some back from Miami. It comes from the Florida Keys, and there you also need your mangroves because I think that state's in a little bit of trouble too.
Yeah.
So that's just one of the examples.
Have you seen with the UN Millennial Goals and the painful statistics coming up about all the biodiversity indicators around the world, have you seen any uptick in requests from policymakers to learn more about biodiversity? And if so, how's that going? Because that would warm my heart. You should just say yes, even if it's not true. And then tell the truth right after. How about it?
Maggie, we've only known each other a short time.
Yes, you can lie if you need to. Just short.
And I have the greatest regard for you, but no, have not seen an uptick.
Yeah, I thought not.
Now, Now, it also, let's think about just a week ago, the IPCC released another special report, the land report. The content of it is extraordinary. If you haven't had a few minutes to scan it, at least, take a look. I think that there is a lot of knowledge, there are a lot of data points that are accessible to decision makers embedded in that report. The onus is on us to actually deliver the access. People don't know to know, right? Most decision makers, and I should qualify this, I'm talking about folks that are sitting in policy seats, not decision makers in industry. They don't know to know. And they're busy, following up on maintaining basic services and dealing with the latest crises at the local level, at the national level, at the multinational level. So it is on us to actively and proactively look for opportunities to sit down and deliver 3 data points that are relatable, accessible, and have context to their environment. If we take the whale carbon example, that wouldn't make any sense to a mayor or a governor in the middle of the country. They'd understand it, but it wouldn't be relevant. Let's find an example, use the latest data from the scientific community, and what's so powerful about some of these international reports is they're representing bodies of scientists that are so vast, and you all know this, are so vast. It's really tough to stand strong and poke at a body of experts that share consensus around findings that represent years of study and research.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we wanted to have a conversation in this way is that those of us who began our careers with a love affair with policy, no matter what kind it is, recognize, I hope, are beginning to recognize that policy language has virtually little accessibility even to policymakers. And that the role of advocates in the work that we're doing is actually doing exactly what Michelle is suggesting and what Tina is working on, which is creating slides and photographs and vignettes and stories that actually really bring it down to a level of connection to the individuals or to any of us, even to the public at large. This afternoon later, there will be a panel largely composed of folks from the Nature Needs Half movement. And one of the reasons we wanted to talk about biodiversity particularly this morning is that the data is extensive and it's 100% negative. There's not a bunch of bright light out there in that story. Our job is not to deliver totally negative data, but to find ways to reach it in accessible ways. And most of the data is delivered, as all of you know, through numbers. And some dear friends of mine are here will know that my most recent favorite quote is 3 words created by a wonderful woman that started the Stanford Center for Social Innovation. It's a journal. Numbers suppress empathy. And those of us who work in the field of policy and policy education and advocacy have spent a lot of time pounding people with numbers and reaching virtually little success at engaging them in the opportunity or the crisis or both, and in finding ways to give them a window into something like whales when there isn't an obvious connection except for them to see the role of natural systems in self-correcting if we don't overwhelm those systems right at the beginning. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of the programs that are happening at GRID, Arendelle, the videos, the films, and they're really working in partnership with the UN to deliver communication tools. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so GRID is a collaborating center of the United Nations Environment Program. So what that means is they're not funding us, but we do a lot of work on their behalf. And our we deliver projects for them. We do a lot of communication projects for them. But I think the important thing to know about GRID is our motto is environmental knowledge for change. We sit in that nexus between the science and the policy. We take the science and we apply it, we translate it. So we are known for our communications products, so whether it's graphics, whether it's videos, but we also do a lot of reports. And again, with the idea of making that science accessible. We had a little talk yesterday that one of the most important things, and I know there's a lot of filmmakers here, so you'll know this, know your audience. You really have to know who you're communicating to, because you'll need to shape your message a little bit different for different audiences. And that is something that we try. We're not always just dealing with policymakers. We work with local communities as well. And they don't need the highfalutin language of the policymakers. They want to know what's relevant to them in their daily lives. How does it affect, their ability to go fishing or their ability to protect themselves in a storm? So that's the kind of things that we're trying to deliver. But it's sometimes tough to know your audience, because even with the great colleagues who I work with at GRID, sometimes it's when our communications people say, "Who's your audience?" Well, it's everybody. Okay, you're going to have to narrow that down just a little bit. Oh, well, it's the broad public, the general public. It's like, okay, can we get a little more specific? So it's a challenge, though. It's you really do have to know who you're talking with and to use the language that makes the information accessible to them.
Right. One of the things we've talked about in the last few days, and when you're working with message delivery, whether it's a meme, a frame, a video, whatever, is the first job and the hardest job is to identify the audience, especially when we know on some level the audience is everyone. Mm-hmm. And yet that's impossible, and not all communications reach. And if they could, wouldn't affect everyone. So you have to segment your audience, even if you don't want to, and even if you're clear that everyone needs to hear this. But everyone cannot hear what you need to deliver at one locus and in one way, which is why the work of communication, even if you're strictly talking about policymakers as opposed to a broader audience, still needs an enormous amount of segmentation and recognition, which you talked about a little bit. Will you talk about that just a little bit more, about some of the things you've done? And I'd love you to tell the story about Newt Gingrich, because I didn't.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you touched it just enough so everyone here might walk away thinking, oh, yes. Newt Gingrich.
What does he have to do with this?
Yeah. So actually, I'll couch that story in the context of the power of story. And really, if you reflect, when you're leaving here and you're on the plane or car, however you're going back to where you're from, maybe I could invite you to think about, what's your favorite story from the 3 days you've been here? What's the story that you might share back to others who ask you, well, what were you just doing in Aspen? What'd you learn? And to convey that in a story. So let me try this out with you if I could, and let me know how I do with this, because I'm learning this craft. At the same time, humans, we're all born with the ability to tell their stories. So I've been in my role, I serve as the Executive Director of the National Council for Science and the Environment, and our core community is deans and directors across the scientific enterprise. We're discipline agnostic. Every year we do a big annual conference in Washington, D.C. Around 1,000 scientists come. If any of you are interested, please chat with me. We would love to have you. The mission of our organization is to improve the scientific basis of environmental decision making. We do that without partisanship. And so with all that as the background, my first year in the job, never been to a conference before for this organization, had never heard of NCSE before I was invited to join. And coming from a policy place and then all of a sudden working with lots and lots of scientists, setting aside how humbling the experience continues to be. And it's extraordinary. I learned so much. Every scientist I meet, I learn something new. It's incredible. I realized that our room really liked to be comfortable. So we had 1,000 people, roughly, and they all really want to be comfortable together. And we know what this is like. We have our room here. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, if our mission is to improve the scientific basis of environmental decision-making, and we're a nonpartisan organization, why do we have an entire slate of speakers planned, all of whom clearly agree with the work that we are doing and the way we're presenting it and our position on it? Why don't we disrupt everyone's comfort and reach out and find somebody who does have history with science, strong history with R&D, as a widely recognized policymaker? So we rattled the cages a bit, and the person that we came upon was Newt Gingrich. I'm going to guess that most everyone in the room knows who that is. And when we announced that he was going to be one of our keynote speakers, all sorts of interesting things happened. There was a call for my removal from my position. We lost about 20% of the attendees at our conference. The hotel where we had the conference had to get extra security, and people came and, what's the word? Protested.
In one swoop, she said, recall, petition, protest. Keep going.
Right. So here I am. You know, I've been reminded now infinitum that I don't have a PhD, that I'm not a scientist. I stood my ground. We had Newt on our stage, and he had more people in there. And we had around 1,800 people show up for this lunch talk. Standing room. And I'm sitting with him in the green room, and one of our board members, who's a well-known scientist also, Rita Caldwell. Rita and Newt are friends. You can just let that hang there in the room for a bit. And I said to him, well, you know, are you nervous about going out in front of our room? And he looked at me and he said, well, why? Do you think I make everyone uncomfortable? And I looked at him and I said, yes, I think they're very uncomfortable. And he said, it's all right. I'm used to that. So he came out on the stage, and the first thing he said was, I want everybody in the room here to raise their hand if they're unhappy or uncomfortable that I'm in front of you. 1,800 hands shot up. And then he went on to talk about some of the work that he had done when he was Speaker of the House. And one of the things that was a big surprise to so many of the people in the room who had very little experience hearing directly from someone in that role, a national level policymaker, was that he had doubled his first term and then tripled the R&D budget of NSF. And then he also shared an opinion, which I want to share with you, and then I'll stop. And again, this is a story. So maybe you'll carry this with you as you frame your story, because I know we're past time. He said, you know, scientists, I love you all. You're terrific. We couldn't do what we do without you. But I got to tell you, this climate change thing, you really got it wrong. And he said, you don't have the science wrong. And I'm going to caveat again. I'm not saying I agree with him. This is my story I'm sharing. The climate science you got right. The way you talk to us about it, you've had wrong since day one. I'm going to leave it there.
So the point of our panel this morning is to get us to think hard about how we speak. And to remember that just because we believe something is true and we're passionate about it, that we are not convincing ourselves of what it is we need to do. We are actually talking to someone who may not understand, who may disagree, and who needs to see a firefly in the dark where they are. Bless you. Thank you.